We have already discussed the trachea just a bit as it left the lower part of the larynx. And as you can note, the trachea is a single tube that's going to convey air to the lungs. It's going to split into a left and a right primary bronchus. One thing to note about it, it has C-shaped cartilages holding it open, giving it some rigidity so that fast airflow doesn't collapse it. But on the posterior side, it has a fibroelastic membrane. That's because the esophagus would typically be found here, and if the esophagus were to swell with food as someone was passing to the stomach, it might actually damage a very rigid circular structure. So we have C-shaped cartilages maintaining the rigidity of the trachea, but this membrane allows it to accommodate the bolus of food moving down the esophagus. Now to see where the larynx is in situ, we're going to use this model again. So we've got the lungs present here. We're going to lift those just off, removing some of the diaphragm with it. And we're going to see the heart one more time, but instead of focusing on the heart, we're going to lift it out and take a look at the trachea itself. We can see the trachea here, covered by the large vessels, and right here, it splits. Now, the very bottom cartilage here is called the carina, where it splits, and it's going to split into a right primary bronchus, a little bit more vertical than the left primary bronchus. But I want you to note that the primary bronchi are going to split into secondary bronchi. We have a superior, a middle, and inferior secondary bronchus on the right side, just as we have a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe of the lung. So each lobe gets its own secondary bronchus, and on the left we have a superior and inferior primary bronchus, mostly because we have only a superior and inferior lobe on the left side. So now we're going to take a look at the lungs themselves. We'll put all of this back mostly so that it's not in our way. We'll now take a look at this model of the right lung that we can remove. Now we'll note that it has multiple surfaces on it, and these are going to have some unique features. On the outer side we have the costal surface, which would be in contact with the ribs. And then here on the under or inferior side we have the diaphragmatic surface, where the thoracic diaphragm is going to sit and allow us to have the thoracic cavity expand and contract so that the lungs inflate and deflate. There's a cardiac impression just here on the right side where the heart would be in contact, and sometimes there's a small esophageal impression, but we don't see that too clearly on this model. Right here where the blood vessels of the pulmonary artery and vein, as well as the bronchi, are traveling into the lungs, this is called the hilum, and the hilum is just going to be where these structures are coming and going from the substance of the organ itself. Now we mentioned that there's a superior, middle, and inferior primary bronchus because there are superior, middle, and inferior lobes. So here, the superior lobe is going to be separated from the others by a variety of these fissures. So we have a superior lobe, an inferior lobe, and just here, it's a little bit tough to see, but we have a middle lobe. The middle lobe is separated from the superior lobe by the horizontal fissure, and the middle lobe and superior lobe are separated from the inferior lobe by this oblique fissure that runs all the way across here. And these distinctions aren't just on the surface, they go very deep because we have the secondary bronchi associated with them as well. So here, we're going to take a closer look at the hilum of the right lung. So here, we can see that we've got the airway, both posteriorly here, and then in blue we have the pulmonary artery, and in the red we have the pulmonary veins. Because this is getting blood from the heart, this is one of the only times we're going to see this. We have deoxygenated blood traveling in the artery, pulmonary artery here, and oxygenated blood traveling back from the lungs to the left atrium of the heart in the pulmonary veins. And we can notice here that on the right side, the pulmonary artery is going to be anterior to the airway. Now we do the same thing with this model of the left lung, and overwhelmingly it's very similar, but there are some differences. Again, we have a costal surface and a diaphragmatic surface where it's contacting those structures. We're going to be having a much larger cardiac impression since the heart is a little bit more prominent on the left side of the thorax, and then we have a more pronounced aortic impression there as well, since the ascending aorta travels this way to become the arch of the aorta, and then descends, and that's a little bit more on the left than the midline, so we actually have that impression present here in the left lung. The hilum, once again, is here, where the blood vessels and airway are entering and exiting from the substance of the lung. And now let's take a look at our lobes. There are only two lobes of the left lung. They're separated by an oblique fissure just here. We have a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. But note that the superior lobe has this little kind of extension just here, hanging down by the cardiac impression. This is called the lingula of the superior lobe of the left lung. And the whole superior lobe, once again, is separated from the inferior lobe by the oblique fissure. There is no horizontal fissure in the left lung. Taking a closer look at the hilum of the left lung, just here, we can see that once again we've got the vessels and airway traveling in conjunction with each other. Here we have the airway here, primary bronchus, and deoxygenated blood here in the pulmonary artery, and oxygenated blood here in the pulmonary veins. And on the left side, the pulmonary artery tends to be more superior than anterior to the airway. So one small difference right there.
Typically in these videos, I've been sticking with the gross anatomy, or the easy to see macroscopic level. But to understand the respiratory system, it's actually very useful to look at some of the cells and structures that make it up at the microscopic level. To quickly note here, we can see that a large portion of the respiratory tract is lined by what is known as a respiratory epithelium, with these pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells. The important thing for you right now is to note that ciliated part. There's mobile cilia on their surface that helps move mucus along, which gets particulate matter out of our airways back to where it can be either swallowed or spit out. Now, if we take a look at the lung as a whole, you notice there is a lot of space in it. That's because we have gas exchange happening. So the further we go into the lung, the more we're getting into these fine little honeycombs where the gas exchange happens. Right here, front and center, we can see that we've got a bronchial, a bronchus. This bronchus is clearly a bronchus because it has cartilage lining its outside, as well as smooth muscle lining it as well. We take a closer look. The cartilage helps to hold these airways open and stiffen their kind of area. Stiffen their area, good Lord. Cut in. Typically during these videos, I stop when we get to the end of the gross anatomy, or the obviously visible part of the anatomy of a person. But for the respiratory system, it's actually very useful to look at how it appears microscopically to understand its function completely. We can see here that some of the upper part of the respiratory system, along with the trachea and some of the bronchi, contain these pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells. And what you need to know about that is that they're called a respiratory epithelium. And the important thing right now is that they have these cilia on their apical surface, and that helps them sweep mucus up the airway so that particulate matter that gets stuck in it can be removed from the body. Looking at the lung from a kind of zoomed out view, you should notice that there's just a lot of space in the lung. It's very spongy, kind of a honeycomb appearance, and that's because the deeper we go, the more we want space available for gas exchange. Front and center here we have a bronchus sitting next to an artery, and so we can kind of zoom in on that and see what makes them work the way they do. Unlike the trachea, which has C-ringed cartilages, the bronchi, especially as they get smaller, tend to have plates of cartilage in the wall, but not coming around and forming a complete circle or C shape. So we're just picking up bits of cartilage here and here and here to stiffen the airway. Nearby, we've got the airway itself here with the respiratory epithelium, and note the smooth muscle in its wall that allows the airway to be constricted or relaxed depending on how open we want it to be for gas exchange. Nearby we have large vessel, and we have the pulmonary arteries traveling in close proximity to the actual airway, whereas the pulmonary veins tend to travel separately on their own. If we zoom in, we can just get a closer look again at that cilia on the respiratory epithelial surface, smooth muscle here, and stiff cartilage nearby. as the airway gets smaller and smaller and branches further and further, we actually wind up leaving the transmitting area here, which is just conveying gas to and from the lowest part of the lungs, and we enter an area where we see these thin little chambers coming off of there. So these bronchioles, or these very small bronchi, are going to open up into the gas exchange portion of the lungs, and right here we've got this big, long stretch of airway leading to individual little cells or little rooms here. These are called alveoli. This hallway, or whatever you conceive of it as, is an alveolar duct, and it's leading to these individual alveoli where gas exchange between the blood and the airway actually happens. And for that to occur, we have to have very thin walls. So we can see here that we've got the alveoli made up of some blood vessels. You can see a vessel right there, as well as some thin cells lining the surface. But every so often we also see a nice big thick cell blebbing off there as well. So we zoom in a little bit. The thinnest cells that are lining the airway are called type 1 pneumocytes, and they're very thin because they line the small capillaries conveying blood through these walls here. The alveolar walls, or alveolar septa, have blood vessels within. We have thin type 1 pneumocytes on the surface, and that's the place where gas exchange is happening between the airway and the blood. And nearby we have these big type 2 pneumocytes. What's funny about these is that there's actually more of them than there are type 1 pneumocytes. But because the type 1 pneumocytes spread out so much, we don't actually get to see how many of these cells actually are there. These type 2 pneumocytes can create more type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes if need be, but they also release something called surfactant that lowers the pressure in the lungs and allows expansion to happen uniformly so that we don't have the alveoli collapsing. Now last, we have this picture, which is highlighting the blood vessels, the capillaries inside that alveolar wall or alveolar septum. So you can see that these red blood cells are lined up and they're exchanging gas through the type 1 pneumocytes and their underlying epithelium right there. And that's exactly how oxygen comes into the blood to be returned to the heart, and how carbon dioxide leaves the blood to go into the airway to be exhaled.
To finish up our study of the respiratory system, we're actually going to return to the lungs in the thorax. Now the lungs take up space in what is called a right pleural cavity and a left pleural cavity, and they're actually separate from the heart, which normally sits inside its own connective tissue structure called the pericardium. So I'm going to do my best to gently remove the model of the lungs and the heart here. And here we've got the lungs aside the aorta and esophagus here, so I'll try to remove those as properly as I can. And then we'll get the rest of the lung out of the way here on the left. And here on the right, we'll get rid of this as well, but we're actually going to put it back momentarily, because now I want you to see the lining of this cavity. This lining that fills the space in which the lungs sit is called the parietal pleura. So the pleura of the wall of the thoracic cavity, it's got several parts: the large costal pleura alongside the ribs, the diaphragmatic pleura, the cervical pleura, and then the mediastinal pleura where it sits next to the heart, and we have the hilum transitioning between the two. Notice that we have intercostal vein, artery, and nerve traveling here. They're deep to the pleura, but actually supply it with pain sensation. And now I'm going to put this lung back in place, if I have any luck at all. And I want you to note that we have the parietal pleura here. The lung sits inside of it, but the lung itself is covered by what's known as visceral pleura. That's just the outer lining of the lung. So if we look, we can see that the space between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, in this case the costal pleura, there's a small space there called the pleural space, and this is a normal anatomic feature and typically has a little bit of fluid inside of it so that the lungs are stuck to the parietal pleura, and as the chest expands, the lungs expand as well to bring air in, and as the chest contracts and the diaphragm rises, it is expelled and the lungs move with the rest of the body. And we can get some problems if we have air or fluid or other substances filling that space, potentially compressing the lungs.